Good morning, everyone, in U.S. History 1. It's the final chapter, Chapter 15, Reconstruction. Many different U.S. History 1 and 2 courses have slightly different endpoints and starting points. And I know I've taught U.S. History 2 where it starts with Reconstruction, and U.S. History 1 ends with the closure of the Civil War. Um, I like the fact that U.S. History 1 at the Mount and in this textbook does cover Reconstruction because it's really an important aftermath of the closure of the war, the actual physical violence, although there's violence after the war as well in terms of what I consider to be guerrilla warfare, because the wars don't always just end on a date where we decided at, for example, the Appomattox courthouse where Lee surrenders to Grant. We know that there's still significant conflict, and there's a certain degree of resentment and resistance in the South to go along with basically the Unionists' platform, including the ending of slavery. But let's begin with that concept. Here we are. It's the end of the Civil War. The North is victorious. The South has lost. The South surrenders. Well, what are we going to do? Is the South going to be treated as conquered territory to be absorbed by other northern states? Are they going to be put into some kind of period of occupation in some way? Are they going to be sanctioned and punished? Are there going to be land reformation policies, perhaps to distribute lands to non-Confederate interests, including freed African American slaves? All of these questions were swirling around as to how we deal with the South now that the Civil War has closed. Interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln's assassination, he was already planning. The war wasn't over yet, but Abraham Lincoln was already of the mindset that the war was probably going to be successful for the North. And what was he fighting for? Everyone thinks Lincoln and the North was fighting to end slavery. Ultimately, that became the crux of the causation of the Civil War. But the North was trying to preserve the Union. And that's what it was, saving the Union. That's their goal. That's their intent. So part of the thought process for Lincoln as war was coming to a close, and they knew the North was likely to be successful, this Anaconda plan of slowly starving out both in terms of supplies and resources, but in terms of success, the South was slowly going to eventually lose this conflict, although surprisingly in a much more drawn out fashion than the North had hoped. So how are we going to bring the South back in? What are we going to do? Lincoln wanted a very modest policy of reuniting the country, meaning he wanted to almost convey an olive branch to the South, say, come back into the fold. You have to end slavery. You have to recognize the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And all he wanted was 10% of the population of those states in rebellion to swear loyalty to the Union and to the now recently adopted 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, and recognize the supremacy of the federal government. And then those states could start up a state government and eventually become basically back participating within the constitutional framework of the United States of America. So Lincoln didn't want retribution. He didn't want massive sanctions against the South. He wanted to help reconstruct the South and the nation into one union again. Fortunately, we know what happens to Lincoln. I told a terrible joke in class one time. I want to repeat it here, where I do collect weird little historical fragments from history when I can get them. And I told him, I said, recently I got a thing off of Lincoln's desk, and it was this checklist of things to do for, I give the specific month and day. It was a specific date here. April 14th, I said I got a memo from Lincoln's desk of the things he was going to do, and it was written on April 13th, things to do in the upcoming weeks. And one of them was to increase the security at Ford's Theater to protect the patrons there from potential rebel attacks. And of course, on April 14th, he was assassinated in Ford's Theater in 1865. It's a terrible joke because it's not true. He had nothing to do with the private theater's security, but we know he's assassinated, and he's assassinated by a zealot of the Confederacy, John Wilkes Booth. And the irony of it is because of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the South is going to have a more troubled time in rejoining the Union, because the radical Republicans And ironically, that's what they were called at the time. Thaddeus Stevens, our own Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, they want punishment. They want to strip the lands from Confederate ownership. They want it redistributed to African Americans. They want equal civil rights, not just freedom from the bondage of slavery, but they were very progressive and very aggressive. And they wanted to punish and sanction the South and basically redistribute wealth to the recently freed African American, a form of reparations, if you will. And um, the South, by not the South, it wasn't the South in uniform, but basically by the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, it was the worst thing they could hope for. Because Abraham Lincoln was much more of a pragmatist in recognizing how do you heal the bonds and the wounds, or how do you bind up the wounds of the Civil War, is through a certain degree of attrition and decency, even though the South didn't actually deserve that necessarily, but Lincoln recognized in order to heal the nation that was required. So Lincoln gets assassinated. We know what happens after that. Is there the vice president, Andrew Johnson, who is a very, very racist individual. He's very pro states' rights. He doesn't like federal involvement in the South. He wants to end this period of what we call Reconstruction, where there are northern federal troops in the South controlling the state governments down there. He wants to end it all. The one thing that he's not pro about the South is the South was almost always controlled commercially and politically by the aristocracy, the large plantation owners. That's the one thing that Johnson didn't like. He didn't like the wealthy Southern plantation owners, and he did want to see their wealth redistributed, but not to African American slaves. He wanted to create a new class of Southern whites that dominated Southern politics. Unfortunately, he was unpopular almost everywhere, and he really came to loggerheads with the radical Republicans in Congress. And the book doesn't get into this, but this is a time of ascendancy of Congress. Congress becomes extremely powerful. The president becomes extremely weakened. So weakened, in fact, that they pass a law called the Tenure Act, where if the president has somebody in office, a secretary of state, a secretary of war, a secretary of agriculture, I don't know all the cabinet level positions, but if there is one in office and the president decides to fire them, because the Senate approved them, they passed this new law that the Senate must also approve the firing. And what that was designed to do was keep Andrew Johnson having to deal with the Republic. He wasn't a true Republican, he was really a Democrat, to have the power of the incumbency of those seats stay in control of the viewpoint of the radical Republicans. What does Andrew Johnson do? He fires someone. I think it was a Secretary of War. I think it's Stimson he fires. And the Congress sees their opportunity. They impeach Andrew Johnson, the first president ever impeached. All that takes is a majority of the House of Representatives to impeach, which means charge you with a crime. And the crime was violating the Tenure in Office Act, which was unconstitutional anyways. Most people knew it was unconstitutional. So they brought it on very thin veiled grounds because they had a president that was at odds with their philosophy of how to treat the South after the Civil War. It comes down to one vote. Andrew Johnson survives, and there should be a movie made. I know there was one because I watched it as a kid with my dad about the impeachment of. Wasn't very good, but talk about a good movie because it was talk about bite your fingernail type of tension. They actually thought that the last vote was going to go against Johnson and he would be convicted. It takes 2/3 of the Senate to convict and therefore remove a person from office. Very, very difficult standard. In this one, I believe it was a Kentucky Republican who was a radical Republican. He was expected to vote in favor of conviction. He changed his mind at the last minute. It remains one of the great mysteries of history why to do it. Andrew Johnson survived impeachment. I don't like Andrew Johnson. He's a bigoted man. He's a narrow-minded man. He is trying to undermine the ending of slavery wherever he can. In fact, a better word, he's also kind of a jerk. He's an obstructionist. He's not letting Congress get to do what it needs to get done. But I actually wanted him to survive impeachment because if he was impeached, it would have shifted the constitutional balance of powers, the checks and balances of the presidency versus the Congress versus the courts really would have been lost if Congress could wield that kind of power of removal over really trumped up charges. The charges were real, but they were on a trivial, really constitutional statute that the federal Congress had passed. And the ascendancy of Congress would have been too far, and I think it would have put our country in chaos. But that's neither here nor there. That's Andrew Johnson. He's very unpopular. We know he's going to be voted out of office. So the politics of Reconstruction, how do we bring these people back in? We know slavery is ended with the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment, it gets passed in, what year was it exactly? I know it's 1865. Yeah, January 31st, 1865. Slavery is gone a constitutional. A lot of people think Congress passes a constitutional amendment. Well, it has to after 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate pass it, but 3/4 of the states then in the Union at the time have to also agree to create that constitutional amendment, and it passes. Uh, Slavery is over. And what do Southern whites, and remember, I think it's only 1 in 7 Southern whites actually own slavery, but the institution of slavery was seen as part of Southern culture, and it was seen as the the war of the Northern aggression, basically controlling Southern states' rights was the argument. And the South tried to portray through history and through history revisionism that the war wasn't about the evils of slavery. It was. It was about slavery and determining whether or not slavery should expand or ultimately get nullified and ended. But the South tried to convey it as a war of Northern aggression, getting into the states' rights. It was denying states their sovereignty. And that's not necessarily true, because even under the Confederacy, the states had less autonomy than they did under the Union. So the war was over slavery in the end. So 13th Amendment ends it. But what do the southern states start doing? They create something called the Black Code. Some people argue that they still exist today. Not overtly, they don't, because the 14th Amendment would bar that. And what the Black Codes were in this era were designed to say, okay, you might be free from slavery, but we're going to create all kinds of other laws to make it really almost impossible to participate in civic life. You still can't be on a jury. You still can't testify against a white person in a trial. There were vagrancy laws. If you were caught basically out there not working and you didn't have employment papers, you could be charged with vagrancy, given a big fine. Of course, you don't have any money. You're a recently freed slave. There's no work for you. And so what do? They say, we'll work off the fine. You have to go work on such and such a plantation in order to pay your fine. It was slavery in another form. And so that's what the North, the radical Republicans wanted to stop, were these black codes. Slavery by another name. Black codes effectively criminalized Black people's leisure, limited their mobility, and locked many into exploitive farming contracts. And so that was the real problem. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to participate in civic life. They couldn't run for office. And then comes the 14th Amendment. In my opinion, the most important amendment to the United States Constitution, other than freedom of speech. And the reason why freedom of speech is so important, it gives us the ability to complain and to advocate change and to have freedom of press to bring about revelations about what our government is doing and why it's doing it. But the 14th Amendment, well, one, it makes many of the Bill of Rights applicable to state action, because one, it first established citizenship for all people born in the United States, including African Americans. One of the groups that was exempted, unfortunately, was Native Americans, because they were considered sovereign within their own territorial reservation system. But it's kind of a tragedy that Native Americans can't become citizens of the United States, but African Americans do get it through the 14th Amendment. And so when it creates citizenship, it undoes the Dred Scott decision saying African Americans can never be citizens because they're not really human beings. But the second is, it says no state, this is where the federal government really limits state autonomy now, no state can deny its citizens due process of law and substantial due process. And what that ultimately means is things that are basically what we deem to be unalienable rights, like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to petition the government, freedom from unreasonable search and seizures, freedom from cruel and abusive processes. All of these things now have to be allowed and honored by the states for all citizens. And this is a huge strengthening of federal authority in states' behaviors. And it's also the mechanism by which African Americans and many other groups later on, gays and lesbians, people with disabilities, other minority groups who feel like they've been somehow treated disparately and inappropriately, have used the 14th Amendment to argue that the states can't take away certain fundamental rights that our culture and our society has recognized, either in the Bill of Rights or in other historical and cultural settings. So the 14th Amendment's huge, and that gets ultimately passed in June 13th, 1866. And these are sometimes called the Reconstruction Amendments or the Civil War Amendments. 13th Amendment frees African Americans from slavery bondage directly, but indirectly, we know it remains significantly watered down because of these black codes. And how do we get rid of some of these black codes? The 14th Amendment helps do that significantly. And then the 14th Amendment, although I think my interpretation of it certainly can't deny anybody the right to vote because of race, color, creed, or national origin. I would think the 14th Amendment incorporates that. But because Southern states weren't recognizing it, they created the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was basically you can't discriminate in the right to vote in everything from municipal elections right up to federal elections because you're a black or African American male. Now, this actually divides the suffragette movement on the women's side because the women's groups and the different civic associations that women groups started fought significantly to free slavery, to end slavery. They were abolitionists by nature. But when the 15th Amendment came in, they were outraged that they didn't get the right to vote as well. So women still remain sort of a second-tiered type of citizen. And this splinters the women's movement in such a way that one actually branches off and tries to argue the reason why they need to vote is to be a check on African American participation. Basically, it was a racist ideology that suggested that white women needed the right to vote in order to counter, the negative aspects of giving black men the power to vote. And it's too bad because there was one time that the women's suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement as a whole were very united in trying to create a more equitable and fair society, but they splinter as a result of African American males getting the right to vote with the 15th Amendment's adoption in 1869, I believe, is the 15th Amendment. But anyways, those three amendments are critical, and it does bring a division in the suffragette movement because the women were just outraged. What about us? We were fighting for all these causes. Everyone else seems to be getting their sort of the seat at the table, and women are still denied. And they actually one group does, not all of them, but one group actually takes a very racist position going forward, saying that the reason why women need the right to vote is to be a check on the dangers of giving African Americans the power to vote. Now, during Reconstruction, there's a bit of a renaissance for African Americans, a beautiful time when the southern states have 5 military districts controlled by Union soldiers, and there's a group called the Freeman Bureau, and they were designed to basically help recently freed African Americans get on their feet, start participating in civic life, start hopefully getting into contracting. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough money and not enough ability of the federal government in the North to make it universally applicable throughout the South. But in the large cities like South Carolina, for example, is a perfect example where African Americans not only ran for Congress, but they won. They became United States senators. I think there's one senator from South Carolina, but many were members of the House of Representatives. Many ran for local government and won. It's kind of like the envisionment of not just Abraham Lincoln, but many people that believe in the ending of slavery saw that these people could participate in civic life just as much as anybody else. And it's a bit of a beautiful, I think, period of time where Reconstruction seems to be giving us the promise of what the Declaration of Independence claimed for, that all men are created equal and should have basically an equal stake in society, and that certain inalienable rights are affordable to all of us and should be granted because they're God-given and no other human being should be able to take them away. And the public school system started up in the South at this point. Prior to that, there were no public schools very much in the southern states. And so there was a bit of a renaissance. And there's a great picture on 409, I think it's 409, your book, hopefully my book as well, of some of the true progress that happened during this period of time. African Americans, local, state, national offices, including both houses of Congress. And they give one senator, the African American senator, which was Hiram Revels, and there was 6 or 7 other members of the House of Representatives. Curry and Ives, I collect Curry and Ives print if I can find them, and that one shows that Reconstruction was working in terms of not creating a second-class group of citizens and hopefully give them civil rights. We know it's not going to last. But a lot of people were surprised by that. There was a pocket of time, a very short period of time, where the black codes were suppressed African Americans did have some protection because of the Union occupation of the southern states and the Freedmen Bureau being active down there, that these things were going to work. There's a backlash. Southern, not all of them, but many of the Southern whites get so resentful of this that they are going to basically infuse and create the Ku Klux Klan and other white racist groups that try to uphold the old order, for lack of a better way of saying it, white power and white control of civic organizations and the economy in the South. But the tension at that point is suppressed by the presence of Union soldiers in the Freedmen Bureau in the South. Now, look at by the end of Reconstruction, and people are saying, "What do you mean? Why did we end Reconstruction?" Well, there comes a time where the Southern states have to get back in union. In the Southern states, those that really had the power, saying, "If you really want us to participate and rejoin the Union, you got to get these Southern troops out of here. Let us have home rule." And that ends in 1877. So roughly 12 years, we have this Reconstruction period, and African Americans, especially in the more urban or developed areas, they do pretty darn well, and they prove to themselves that they can be business owners, they can be part of civic life, they can be mayors and city councilors, and um, they can be treated as human beings. And unfortunately, that's not going to last too long. And we'll talk about why in a second. So the radical Republicans wanted to take away the land from the plantation owners, and there was an old saying, I think it was 40 acres and a mule, a form of reparations, if you will, a form of land reform. Southerns would have no part of it, and the radical Republicans even got pushed back by people within their own party, because there was always a recognition the one thing you don't take away from a person is their property, because a long part of our history was fighting over the recognition of property rights, and it just didn't go far enough. So these reparations were never given. The Freedmen Bureau did distribute funds and did help some people buy some homesteading and get some farms going, but it was few too far in between overall. Yeah, it's Thaddeus Stevens. If you watch the movie Lincoln, it's fantastic. Thaddeus Stevens in the movie is, and when he goes to bed at night, he has an African American woman as his wife and lover and things like that. And people suggest that's part of the motivation. I don't care what his motivation was, but Thaddeus Stevens was definitely a radical Republican, looking for pure equal rights for formerly freed African American slaves. And so was our own Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. However, unfortunately, the proposed land reform bills were tabled in Congress. Radicalism had its limits, and the Republican Party's commitment to economic stability eclipsed their interest in racial justice. So one of the new things that did start up, if you hear the term sharecropping, no longer was slavery involved, but the former plantation owners couldn't necessarily afford to pay wages, fair wages, to African Americans or other labor groups. So what did they do? Is they offered sharecropping. They would give a certain portion of their land. You can use it, and basically you're going to be a lessee, and you have to give me so much profit or so much of the sharecropping. The crop, I get 50% of the crops for you to use my land. It was pretty oppressive to African, but they were still free. They determined the work hours and how they were going to work, and their industry would be rewarded proportionally to the amount of effort they put in. But they're still what? They're still under the thumb of basically a white supreme class in the southern states. There's no question about it. And the churches really take over, benefiting the southern community. Churches spring up all over, African American dominated churches, but they become more than just churches. They become cultural centers, civic centers, and educational centers. And I look at what Booker T. Washington famously described all these churches. And it was like the whole race was trying to go to school. Few were too young and few were too old to make the attempt to learn. And many of these schoolhouses were crowded with people from the ages of 3 to 80 because people wanted to take advantage of these new rights, and they did. Unfortunately, we know there's a huge backlash. Yeah, black churches provided centralized leadership and organization in post-emancipation communities. In fact, many of the early civic leaders, that were on city councilors and state representatives and things like that, that were African American, were often your local clergy. They were the religious groups because they were seen as leaders in the community, and they were often more educated than the rest of the African American previous slaves. Very few of whom were allowed to be educated, not that they couldn't be. And we know the Reconstruction movement, women splinters the women movement. In 1866, the National Women's Rights Convention officially merged with the American Anti-Slavery Society. So things are going well at that point. But then we know with the passage of the 15th Amendment, we know that Stanton and her partner, Susan B. Anthony, They realized their allies were distancing themselves from women's suffrage in order to advocate black enfranchisement. Disheartened, listen to what they said. Stanton and Anthony allied instead with white supremacists who supported women's equality. Basically saying, we need to fight for women's equality, and if allying ourselves with racists, that's better than not getting any rights at all. And unfortunately, it's a black eye or a detriment to the women's movement in looking at history that this group would do that because they felt that's the only way to get their success during that period of time. In actually a case, the women's movement pushes pretty hard, but in 1875, the Supreme Court addressed the constitutional argument that the 14th Amendment afforded women the right to vote, and it said that acknowledged women's citizenship, but arguing that suffrage was not guaranteed to all citizens. And then the Southern women's groups that were honoring their dead husbands and brothers and fathers from the Civil War created this lost cause movement and tried to rewrite history of the antebellum South to de-emphasize slavery as the issue and talked about it as a states' rights and honor and integrity and about the war of the Northern aggression. And that was taught in the South for many, many years, that slavery was a side issue. It wasn't. It was the core of it. Racial violence and Reconstruction. The notion of white supremacy and black inferiority undergirdled it all in the South. There's no question about it. Southern society had been shaken, but Southern whites used black codes and racial terrorism to reassert the former slaves. It's a bit muted during the period of Reconstruction. Why? Because we have Union soldiers in the Freedmen's Bureau down in the South. So blacks had a certain degree of autonomy to enter into business and contracts and marry and open schoolhouses and run for office. But racial violence was significant during this period of time. It took three major forms: riots against political authority, interpersonal fights, and organized vigilante groups. We know about all these. The Ku Klux Klan emerged in the late 1860s as the most infamous of this group, but there were several of them. And the federal government responded to the Southern paramilitary taxes by passing the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, basically forcing the South to not allow these kind of actions to going on, but there just wasn't enough resources to really end it completely. African Americans remained trapped in a world of white supremacy that resisted their economic, social, and political rights. But there's still windows of opportunity during Reconstruction. Yeah, this poor woman here, there's a nice, sometimes I like these little vignettes of real life stories that bring it to life. One is Sally Atkins of Warren County, Georgia, was traveling with her husband, Joseph, who was a state senator. He was assassinated by a Klansman on May 10th, 1869. She wrote to Ulysses S. Grant, who was very much a believer in racial equity and fairness. But it says, this is her letter, it says, "I'm no statesman," she exclaimed. "I'm only a poor woman whose husband has been murdered for his devotion to his country. I may have very foolish ideas about government, states, and constitutions, but I fear that I have claims upon my country. The rebels imprisoned my husband. Pardoned rebels murdered him. There is no law for the punish of him to do the deeds of this sort. I demand that you, President Grant, keep your pledge you made to the Union. Make it safe for any man to utter boldly and openly his devotion to the United States." And it's a really sad part of our American history that there was so much resistance to equality in post-Civil War South and the North, too. Racism is pretty well dispersed, but we know the North was advocating for abolitionism more than the South, at least at some junctures. Yeah, Southern prosperity relied on over 4 million African slaves to grow cotton alongside the number of other people, and that's where sharecropping started, because you have to keep this industry going in some fashion. We know at this period of time that even though it was the Southerners were having enough time just finding enough to eat, they were very, very poor during this era. Yeah, it says for the South as a whole, not just black, the whole South, it was a period of massive, deep poverty that would last until the New Deal era of 1930s. And that's why even black Southerners start converting to the Democratic Party in the 1930s, because of this deep poverty. Poverty is vicious. Those of us that ever suffered from it know that. And it was the Democratic Party of the 1930s that started creating social programs that tried to alleviate some of this poverty. And then the shift from what was once the radical Republican identity started shifting over to the Democratic Party. So I'm going to wonder how the involvement of parties is very interesting. Yeah, it says sharecropping by African American families often led to cycles of debt that kept the family bound to the land forever. The war years forged close relationships between the government and business elite. We know that. But here's the end of Reconstruction. Why does it end? Why don't we do more as a national government to try to change the cycle of racist policy? It ended when Northerners abandoned the cause of the former slaves and Democrats recaptured Southern politics. Between 1868 and 1877, and especially after the Depression of 1873, economic issues became more important than Reconstruction. It was no longer foremost on the national issue. It was about saving the economy. And we know that in 1877, it really ends. There's an election for the presidency of the United States. Rutherford Behaves, a Republican, is up against a New Yorker Democrat by the name of Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden looks like he probably won the election. And you talk about election controversies we have over fraud and everything else. This one was clearly a lot of fraud going on. But there was a recognition that the Union was going to fall apart again in 1877 of who was going to be the president. They had a presidential commission assigned to investigate who really won this thing. And the Democrats and the Republicans reach across the board and they come to a compromise. And the compromise is we'll let Rutherford B. Hayes be the president, the Republican, but you got to end Reconstruction in the South. Southern states need to be left alone. Troops have to be removed. The Freeman bureaus have to go out. And basically, we have to do self-governance. And that's the great compromise of 1877. It ends Reconstruction. Northern troops, Union troops, leave the South. The Freeman Bureau leaves. What do you think now happens with black coats? They get lit up pretty big. And you'll find very few after 1877 African Americans in these former Southern slave states being on city councils, being mayors, being members of the House of Representatives. So there's this weird little pocket after 1865 to 1877 where African Americans did participate significantly both on the federal and state level in civic lives, and especially in those areas where there were Union troops occupying those areas. But after Reconstruction ends, the game's over, and we revert back to a very dark era until when? To the second wave. I call it. There's multiple waves of civil rights activity, but we know it's really until the 1960s, right? The 1950s, really, when the Supreme Court starts taking some activist roles in like a board versus the bar, Brown versus the Board of Education, and other Supreme Court decisions like that. But we know the activism of civil rights and the recognition really doesn't come into the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So, and a really weird little pocket of time where I think maybe the nation was moving in the right direction with Reconstruction, but it ends for African Americans, and it doesn't get sort of a second wind and a second, curative notion until the things like the poll tax end and these other small steps in civil rights, and then the big major accomplishment of 1964 and 1965, the Civil Rights Act. So anyways, that's me talking way too long about a chapter. I think that's really well written. This is the end of the semester, folks. Don't be afraid to reach out, ask questions or anything like that. If you take me for U.S. history too, we tend to start with Reconstruction as well because I think it's important to set the stage for the really still the ascendancy of Congress stays in power really till we get another powerful president. And it wasn't Grant. Grant was a good guy. Unfortunately, Grant was plagued by a very corrupt administration. People around him really sullied his reputation as president, but he himself did a fairly effective job and did want to really bring Reconstruction into existence. But with the end of his presidency and the Compromise of 1877, we know that unfortunately the economic needs of the nation become more paramount than civil liberties and civil rights. But anyways, guys, be good, be well.